Yakutia, 3 in the morning. Outside the cab, it's -40, and the frost has crept so far up the windshield that the glass looks frosted with sugar. Most people picture a trucker in this situation simply pulling over, closing his eyes, and drifting off like anyone would in a warm bed at home. That's not remotely what happens. In reality, he's sleeping inside a metal box that wants to become the same temperature as the world outside it, with an engine that has to keep running just so the air inside doesn't turn lethal, and with a dozen small decisions standing between him and frostbite. Along the Colima Highway, drivers call this stretch of road the Road of Bones, and at night, when the wind picks up and there isn't another headlight for 200 kilometers in either direction, that name starts to feel less like folklore and more like a warning. Every winter, hundreds of long-haul drivers face this exact test, night after night, and the ones who are still doing the job 10 years later are the ones who learned, usually the hard way, which of the popular tricks actually work and which ones will quietly kill you in your sleep. In this video, we're going to walk through exactly how truckers survive a night at 40 below, which widely repeated pieces of advice are dangerously wrong, and what the real, engineered solution looks like. Let's start with the most basic question. Why can't a driver just shut the engine off, zip himself into a warm coat, and call it a night? The answer comes down to how fast heat actually leaves a truck cab. The moment the engine dies, the cab has no more heat coming in, only heat leaking out, through the glass, through the door seals, through the floor and roof panels that were built with ordinary road noise and mild winters in mind, not the Siberian tiger. Within about 20 minutes of the engine going quiet, the internal temperature can already fall by 15 to 20 degrees. Give it a full hour and the cab is often only 5 to 8 degrees warmer than the air outside it, which at 40 below is still a death sentence if you're asleep and unprepared. This is exactly why, for decades, the standard practice among long-haul drivers was to simply never turn the engine off in serious cold. Idling all night burns comparatively little fuel, and it was, for a long time, the only thing standing between a sleeping driver and hypothermia. Naturally, where there's a widespread danger, there's also a pile of half-true advice trying to solve it. One popular idea online is to bank snow up around the base of the cab, the theory being that it blocks wind and traps warmth like an igloo. In practice, snow doesn't generate any heat at all. It just slightly slows the rate at which the cold outside reaches the metal, and it does almost nothing once wind gets moving. Another common suggestion is to crank the heater to maximum right before bed, let the cab get as warm as possible, and then shut everything off and try to sleep through the residual warmth. This runs headfirst into the same problem. Without a continuous heat source, that warmth bleeds out just as fast as it built up, and a driver can find himself waking at 2 in the morning with frost forming on the inside of the windshield. Physics doesn't negotiate. Without ongoing heat input, an unheated cab in 40 below conditions is simply not survivable through the night. Even with the engine running, the amount of usable warmth that actually reaches the cabin is limited. A diesel engine produces plenty of heat, but only a fraction of it is funneled into the cab through the cooling system. And idling for 8 or 9 hours straight isn't exactly kind to the engine either. To squeeze a bit more benefit out of it, experienced drivers will wrap the radiator and oil pan in insulating covers and block off part of the grille with cardboard or a fitted curtain, which keeps the engine from overcooling and helps push a bit more heat inward. It works to a point, but it's a patch, not a real fix. and it comes at the cost of higher fuel use and faster wear on the pistons and cylinder walls from running cold for extended stretches. The actual solution, the one that changed the entire industry, is a separate, purpose-built auxiliary heater. We'll get to exactly how those work in a moment, but first it's worth talking about what desperate drivers try when they don't have one, because some of these methods are genuinely frightening. In the more remote corners of the Russian north, there are documented cases of drivers heating stones or bricks over an open fire and then bringing them into the cab on a metal tray to radiate warmth through the night. It sounds almost sensible on the surface. A heated stone cools slowly and gives off steady warmth, but if that brick was heated over an open flame, it's now carrying soot and combustion byproducts into a sealed space with a sleeping person inside. Other drivers turn to small propane camp stoves or catalytic gas heaters. These consume the oxygen in the cab and release carbon dioxide and, more dangerously, carbon monoxide, an odorless gas that a sleeping person has no way of detecting. There's a persistent myth among truckers that catalytic gas heaters are safe, specifically because they don't produce an open flame. It's true the propane oxidizes without visible fire, but the chemical reaction still consumes oxygen and still produces carbon monoxide, just in smaller quantities than an open burner. There have been fatal cases where a driver fell asleep with a gas burner running and simply never woke up, because the body has no built-in alarm for oxygen deprivation during sleep. Another myth making the rounds is that you can run a regular household electric space heater off the truck's battery through a power inverter. In reality, a heater like that draws far more current than the truck's electrical system is designed to sustain overnight, and it will drain the battery dead within 30 or 40 minutes, leaving the driver with no lights, no ignition, and no way to restart the engine in the morning. The reason all of this matters so much is that carbon monoxide is uniquely dangerous. It binds to hemoglobin in the blood roughly 200 times more aggressively than oxygen does, which means even a fairly low concentration, if breathed for a few hours in a sealed cab, can be fatal. There's no smell, no color, no early warning your body will naturally register, which is exactly why any open combustion source inside a closed cab, whether it's a gas burner, a wood fire, or a heated brick, is considered off limits by anyone who's been doing this job long enough to have buried a friend. So what's the actual answer? It's a factory-built auxiliary heater with a fully sealed combustion chamber and its own dedicated exhaust routed outside the vehicle. In the 1990s, a German-made unit flooded into Russian trucking fleets so completely that its brand name basically became the generic word for this entire category of device, the way people say thermos instead of vacuum flask. The unit itself is roughly the size of a shoebox, mounted underneath the cab or tucked into a storage compartment, and it runs completely independently of the main engine. The driver presses one button, and within a couple of minutes, warm, dry air is coming out of the vents. Because it's drawing only enough diesel to run a small combustion chamber rather than an entire engine block, fuel consumption drops to roughly a tenth of what idling the truck all night would cost. This single piece of equipment is arguably what made modern winter long-haul trucking survivable at scale. Understandably, there are fears attached to it too. Some drivers worry that a unit burning fuel inside the truck could explode. In reality, the combustion chamber is fully sealed, and both the air intake for combustion and the exhaust for the burned gases are piped entirely outside the cab, completely separate from the air the driver breathes. Another common concern is that running the heater all night will drain the battery by morning. The fan and the glow plug do use some electricity, But in normal, steady-state operation, the draw is modest, and with a healthy battery, one of these units can comfortably run for 8 to 10 hours while maintaining a livable interior temperature. Mechanically, it's a fairly elegant system. Fuel is pulled straight from the truck's main tank, pumped into a small combustion chamber, atomized by an injector, and ignited by a glow plug. The air used for that combustion comes in through its own separate intake from outside, and the resulting exhaust exits through a small muffler mounted underneath the truck, nowhere near the cabin. A heat exchanger then warms a completely separate stream of air, the air that actually gets blown into the cab, meaning the combustion gases and the breathing air never mix. There are also liquid-based versions of these heaters which tie directly into the engine's coolant system. Rather than just warming cabin air, they heat the coolant itself, both making cold starts far easier and feeding warmth into the cabin through the truck's normal heater core. These units can push the coolant temperature up to around 40 degrees Celsius in half an hour. Many experienced drivers run both types together, an air heater for overnight sleeping comfort and a liquid heater for a smooth engine start in the morning, and consider that combination the gold standard for winter operation. Heat is only half the battle though. At 40 below, the diesel fuel itself starts working against the driver. Diesel contains paraffin waxes that begin crystallizing as the temperature drops, and once enough of them clump together, the fuel stops being a liquid and starts behaving more like a thick, waxy gel that clogs filters and lines. Ordinary summer-grade diesel can start clouding up at temperatures as mild as -5 degrees Celsius. Winter-grade fuel holds out until around -25 degrees Celsius. Specialized Arctic-grade diesel is formulated to handle anywhere from -38 degrees Celsius down to as cold as -52 degrees Celsius. The problem is that out on remote stretches of highway, the fuel station you actually reach doesn't always stock the grade you need, which forces drivers to improvise. One myth that circulates constantly is that you can pour some other liquid into the tank to lower the fuel's freezing point in a pinch. Manufacturers are unanimous that this is a bad idea, since the wrong additive can damage the fuel system and leave a driver stranded with a dead engine in the middle of nowhere, which is a far worse outcome than the gelling problem it was meant to solve. The real solution again comes down to preparation rather than improvisation. Using fuel actually rated for the expected temperature is step one. There are legitimate additives designed specifically to bind those paraffin crystals before they can clump into larger masses. Beyond that, the fuel system itself gets insulated. Fuel lines are wrapped in foam sleeves. The fine fuel filter often gets its own small electric heating element that kicks in automatically on startup. And the tank can be wrapped in technical felt or foil-backed insulation to slow heat loss from the fuel sitting inside it. Then there's the battery, which loses somewhere between 40 and 50% of its usable capacity once the temperature hits -40 degrees Celsius, which is exactly the moment you need it working at full strength to turn over a stiff, cold engine. Since bringing the battery indoors overnight usually isn't practical out on the highway, drivers instead wrap it in an insulating cover that holds on to residual warmth from when the engine was last running. Or they install a second battery wired in parallel for redundancy, or they use a pre-start heater that warms the oil and coolant before the ignition is even attempted. All of that keeps the truck itself alive through the night. But what about the person actually trying to sleep inside it? Even with a properly functioning auxiliary heater, the temperature inside a cab is never perfectly even. It might be a comfortable 20 degrees up near head height and barely 10 degrees down at floor level, since warm air naturally rises and cold air pools low. Because of that, the sleeping setup itself becomes its own small engineering project. Many experienced drivers lay a thick layer of sheepskin or dense felt over the mattress, both materials that conduct heat poorly and don't absorb moisture, which matters more than people expect. On top of that goes a sleeping bag rated for genuinely extreme cold, often goose down or a high-end synthetic fill rated comfortably down to -40 degrees Celsius, ideally with an anatomical hood that seals around the head, since a huge amount of heat is otherwise lost straight out through an exposed scalp. There's a common assumption that the safest bet is just to sleep bundled up in your full winter gear, parka, insulated pants, the works. It actually tends to backfire. Wearing that much insulation traps body heat so effectively that the sleeper starts to sweat, and that moisture works its way into the sleeping bag's insulation. The moment the heater output dips even slightly, that dampness conducts heat away from the body far faster than dry insulation ever would, which is the opposite of what anyone wants at 3 in the morning. There's also a persistent belief that a hot meal or a strong drink right before bed helps you stay warm. Alcohol specifically dilates blood vessels near the skin, which creates a brief, misleading sensation of warmth while actually accelerating how quickly the body loses heat overall, making it one of the worst things to reach for in genuinely cold conditions. A proper hot dinner is fine, even beneficial, but ideally finished at least a couple of hours before sleep, so digestion doesn't interfere with the body's normal temperature regulation. Underneath all of that sits the same layering principle that mountaineers and cold weather workers everywhere rely on. A moisture-wicking thermal base layer sits against the skin first, then a fleece or wool mid-layer that traps a cushion of warmed air close to the body, and finally the sleeping bag itself, whose synthetic or downfill works by creating thousands of tiny pockets of still air, since air, not the material itself, is actually the thing doing most of the insulating. That's also why a sleeping bag shouldn't be too snug. Compressing the fill reduces how much air it can trap and makes it noticeably less effective. In particularly brutal cold, some drivers add a 12-volt electric blanket into the mix, typically drawing somewhere around 50 to 60 watts, which warms the bedding directly and evenly. The one catch is that it needs to be monitored, since leaving it running unattended all night is one more steady drain on a battery that's already working harder than usual in the cold. Which brings us to the real question hanging over all of this. How does a driver protect himself while he's completely unconscious and defenseless for 6 or 8 hours straight? The single most dangerous threat at a winter stop, more dangerous than the cold itself in many documented cases, is carbon monoxide. It has no smell, no color, and a sleeping person has no natural way to sense it building up around them. This isn't limited to the improvised heating methods we already covered either. Even a properly manufactured factory heater can fail, a cracked heat exchanger or a blocked exhaust line can send combustion gases back into the cabin instead of out into the open air. There's a documented case of a driver who died in his sleep because snow had packed into the exhaust outlet of his heater, and the combustion gases backed up and found their way into the cab through the unit's drainage holes instead. There's a widespread belief that cracking a window slightly is enough ventilation to stay safe. In reality, even a small gap, especially with wind hitting the truck, can create a draft that pulls heat out of the cab faster than the heater can replace it, all while providing only marginal air exchange. Other drivers assume they'll simply smell exhaust if something's wrong and wake up in time. But sensory perception dulls significantly during sleep, and carbon monoxide, again, has no smell at all to detect in the first place. The only genuinely reliable safeguard is a standalone electronic gas detector with an audible alarm loud enough to wake a sleeping person. Factory auxiliary heaters do include flame and temperature sensors, but those only monitor the heater's own internal function, not the actual air composition inside the cab, which is exactly why experienced drivers carry a separate portable carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide detector as non-negotiable equipment. Beyond the detector, proper maintenance matters just as much. The heater's air intake needs a grill that keeps snow out. The exhaust outlet needs to be checked and cleared of buildup regularly and positioned where drifting snow can't cover it. And manufacturers of well-known heater brands recommend running the unit at full output every couple of weeks, specifically to burn off carbon deposits that accumulate on the glow plug and inside the combustion chamber over time. Now, for the scenario every long-haul driver dreads. The engine won't turn over, the auxiliary heater has failed, the battery is dead, and the nearest town is 200 kilometers away. In that situation, every hour matters. This is exactly why a properly stocked cab always carries an emergency kit: candles, waterproof matches, dry fuel tablets, a foil-style emergency blanket, high-calorie food bars, and a thermos that was filled with hot tea before setting out. The best-prepared drivers also carry small portable alcohol burners, which can only be used with a window cracked, and every precaution observed, since they carry the same carbon monoxide risk as anything else burning fuel in a sealed space. If the primary heater has genuinely failed, a spare fuel supply for it does nothing. The fix in that moment is rigging a heat-reflective barrier around the sleeping area to hold in body heat and relying on layered clothing, plus a chemical hand warmer to bridge the gap until help or daylight arrives. There's a common instinct that moving around helps generate warmth in a survival situation like this. It actually works against you. Physical movement burns through both energy and oxygen reserves and causes sweating, which is then followed by rapid cooling as that moisture evaporates off the skin. The better move is to stay still, stay bundled, and minimize any unnecessary heat loss. Another idea that occasionally surfaces is using a candle or torch under an overturned bucket to create makeshift, radiant heat. This is genuinely dangerous between the risk of it tipping over and starting a fire and the same carbon monoxide buildup problem we've already covered at length. The actual survival priority in an emergency is conserving whatever heat the body already has, climbing into the sleeping bag, wrapping a mylar emergency blanket around the outside of it to reflect the body's own infrared radiation back inward, and if a candle is used at all, keeping it shielded from any draft inside a proper enclosed lantern rather than exposed. A single candle only produces around 50 watts of heat, which sounds small, but in a sealed, well-insulated space, it can genuinely make a survivable difference. If there's any way to keep a phone charged off a backup battery pack, sending out a location and a distress call becomes the priority the moment the situation is confirmed serious. Ultimately, though, the most reliable defense against any of this isn't a clever trick. It's boring, consistent maintenance. A heating system that's inspected before winter starts, a fuel tank that's never allowed to run low enough to invite a gelling problem, and a battery that's replaced before it's marginal rather than after it fails. That's what actually turns a night at 40 below from a survival story into just another shift. Everything we've walked through today, the sealed auxiliary heater, the layered sleeping system, the gas detector, the emergency kit, is the product of decades of drivers learning, sometimes at a terrible cost, exactly where the real dangers were hiding. The cold out there doesn't care how experienced you are, and it doesn't forgive a mistake. But between the physics, the equipment, and the preparation, it's entirely possible to sleep soundly while the wind is tearing across the taiga, just a few centimeters away on the other side of the glass. What's the coldest you've ever had to sleep through, and what actually got you through the night? If you liked this video, feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. Until then, we will see you in the next one.